Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 42 of Circle of Fellows. This is the monthly live panel discussion that we broadcast out via YouTube Hangouts on air, where 3 or 4 IABC Fellows and either myself or Brad Whitworth as moderator get together to talk about IABC's content theme of the month. And I'm Shel Holtz, I should say. I am also an IABC Fellow and Director of Internal Communications at WebCorp in San Francisco. Also the host of the FIR Podcast Network, a collection of communication-themed podcasts. And very happy to have a terrific panel today to discuss a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I have been researching this topic and collecting data on it for at least the last 4 or 5 years. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation around CEO activism, brand activism, and the role of the communicator in an environment which we're seeing more and more of this, and research that supports the need for it, or at least the desirability of doing it. So before we jump into the topic, first, I want to let everyone know that we will be taking questions live in real time. All you have to do is tweet your question via Twitter, of course, with the hashtag COF42. That is for Circle of Fellows episode number 42. So COF42, I'm monitoring that hashtag and will relay your questions or observations to the panel. And next, let's meet the panel. And as is my habit, we're going to start left to right as I see your thumbnails on the broadcast. And George, that makes you first.
Well, thank you, Shel, and hello, everybody. I'm George McGrath. I'm here in New York City, where I head my communications consulting practice, McGrath Business Communications. We do a lot of work with clients in the areas of issues management, which is related to today's topic. So I'm looking forward to the discussion very much.
Great. Next, as I see you in the film strip here, is Letty.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leticia Narvaez. I'm based in Mexico City. And I have my own consulting firm on communication, corporate communication, corporate social responsibility, and I do a lot of training on communication, and I'm very happy to be here with you.
And next is Priya Bates.
Hello, I'm Priya Bates, and I'm president of Inner Strength Communication based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And we focus on helping organizations enable, engage, and empower their people. So we work with a lot of executives in that capacity as well.
And finally, John Deveney. Do we have audio, John?
You tell me. Do we have audio?
Yes, we do.
Great.
I can hear you.
Good.
Awesome.
Well, or we'll see if that's good or not, huh, Shel? John Deveney with Deveney. We're a full-service marketing firm specializing in crisis. That's one of our focus areas, with offices in South Florida and Louisiana.
Very good. And yeah, we were having some audio difficulties leading right up to the start of the show. The timing is excellent to get that fixed. So let me start with the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is probably the most significant survey that addresses these kinds of issues. And it was released in January, I believe, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, as it is every year. They have been doing this for, I think this is their 19th year, if I remember correctly. And the result, among many results in this study, is that trust in business rose. And the reason for that, starting in 2017, according to one analysis, business leaders started speaking out on subjects that wasn't their traditional domain. It used to be NGOs dealt with this and government dealt with this. And by the way, trust levels in those are not great in the barometer. Things like climate change, immigration, criminal reform, diversity. As these companies took tough stands in 2018, their voices gained authority. This earned trust is particularly noticeable among the group that Edelman calls the informed public. They distinguish between the informed public and the general public. These are respondents who are college educated, earn in the top quartile of their age group, report significant business news and policy engagement. But trust rose in the general population too. Also, 76% of the overall survey response, and they do the study in I think 31 or 33 countries, 76% said CEOs should take the lead on change rather than waiting for government to impose it. And I meant to turn that off. Where was I here? Employees working for companies full-time said they're counting on CEOs to bring change to the world and be a leading voice on tough issues. And that's especially true when it comes to the CEOs of the companies where they work. Respondents said they expect the person at the top of the company to lead in the areas executives used to avoid at all costs, which could be grouped under the heading of anything remotely controversial. This from a report by the editor-in-chief at LinkedIn. What does that say about where we need to be in guiding our executives around issues that used to be outside the scope of anything an organization would touch?
Well, as far as where,
go ahead, John.
Right, as far as where we need to be as professionals and counselors to business leaders, if your leadership is going to take a position like that, your entire organization needs to be prepared to manage a major, very public, and very extended crisis where your leadership, their behavior, your organization, all of its behavior, all its connectivity to different publics and communities is going to be under a microscope. So it's not just, is the CEO prepared, but are all your channels ready to be responsive to that sort of situation? And that preparation is absolutely crucial. And we're seeing our profession really respond to this. You know, if you want to look in what's being offered in CW, in fact, the research you just quoted, I read through IABC's publication, but also, and here's a shameless plug, PR News is doing a summit in Miami next week focused on crisis and media relations and media training. And a lot of discussion is how to prepare leadership to take public positions like that.
And I think that, like, you know, my focus is obviously internal. So it's really thinking about what are the values of the organization and what is its mission and vision, and how do you bring that to life? And it's really connecting those dots between what they're acting and talking about out there and what they're actually doing and saying they're doing inside. So for me, it's always about that alignment. So as soon as there's a disconnect, we're talking about one of our values is respect, and then what we're seeing out there is that we're not being respectful or we're acting in the opposite way. That disconnect is what creates a lot of the issues from a customer perspective as well.
Yes. Besides that, I believe that something that is quite important is that that we have to have the purpose of the company very clear before we are going to coach and to train the CEOs and all the management team. But we need to have the purpose on mind first, clearly articulate why our brand exists and make a proactive effort to address this purpose. And another thing is to identify also our culture, to really connect our stand to a relevant moment of the culture of the company and the external environment.
Boy, that couldn't be more true, Leticia, your comment about culture, because some of the concerns that people are seeing about the top leadership of an organization taking a political stance is seeing it almost like the unionization of the political opinion of an employee base. Mm-hmm. Is it okay for employees to not vote with the party of their CEO or not agree with the political stance of the CEO? And the long-term, really significant impacts on corporate culture, have yet to be charted or really considered. So this is a big leap. I think it's happening clearly, but I don't know that we're all ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask how important alignment with the business is, because I think, in a politically divisive era such as that we are living through now, you have CEOs who have strongly held personal views, and a lot of them just shoot from the hip when they hear something, they say, well, my company won't tolerate this, as opposed to looking for those opportunities that are directly aligned with the business. And, one example of that we have seen very recently, in fact, let me share two. One was Columbia Sportswear, which manufactures the kind of clothing that people would wear outdoors for outdoor activities. And during the U.S. government shutdown, the CEO took out a full-page ad basically decrying what was happening to the national parks in the wake of the shutdown. The other is Patagonia, a similar organization that is all about sustainability in the clothing that they manufacture. And their CEO just announced within the last few days that the $10 million that they got from the tax break that the U.S. Congress passed, I think it was in 2017, is going to be donated to climate change organizations. So these are statements, these are staking out positions. This is reaching out to your publics and letting them know where you stand on something. But they are both directly related to the nature of the business. How important is that?
Well, I think it's very important to consider, because the key thing is your position's got to be authentic. It's got to be business and your values. Those two examples you cited show are companies that, because of the nature of their business, are concerned about the environment, concerned about preserving natural resources in the outdoors. So it's a very natural statement from them. Likewise, I think there was a situation with Dick's Sporting Goods and gun violence, where they sort of changed, they got out of the gun business, where they can weigh an integral part of their business. And they made a decision to do that and take a business hit on getting out of selling, so-called assault weapons. So I think the starting point is it naturally grows out of your business priorities, and that's where you can have the most credibility weighing in on an issue.
But I think it's also understanding who your audience is, right? Understanding who your customers are and where they stand, because I think, or my impression from what I've been reading with both Columbia and Patagonia, is that gamble or that stance is going to pay off from a bottom line perspective.
Well, let's talk about an instance where there were some problems as a result of that. And I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on this. The research for my master's degree was on the very topic. It was looking at corporate social responsibility and how those programs could best match and how you could win over CEOs to join ahead. And the research made it very clear that both, Priya and George are spot on. But it was your question, Shell, that really hit on it. The single most important factor in whether or not a C-suite decision maker will agree or accept or partner with a CSR program is alignment with the business model and with their business. And like George said, that flows out and really manifests as authenticity. And Priya's point about knowing your audience, that audience for business people has been and is very clearly those members of the community that are either customers, clients, or prospects.
Right, or investors.
Right. Absolutely.
I just wanted to raise Delta Airlines for a minute. I saw a video interview with the CEO, Ed Bastian, just this past week. You may remember that they revoked a discount that they were granting to NRA members following the Parkland shooting. That led the Georgia legislature to scrap a jet fuel tax break that they'd been counting on. It cost them $40 million. Bastian says it wasn't a tough decision. He said, if you know who you are, you can make those decisions and sleep well at night. And while it was painful in that there was a penalty attached to it, $40 million, our brand is worth so much more. This leads to a question that I have, and it comes from a number of these studies that says that consumers, prospects, employees, particularly younger millennial aged consumers and employees, expect organizations to invest in social causes. In other words, get away from this notion, I guess you would call it a laissez-faire capitalist notion, that all the money that you make goes back to investors. And some of it has to be diverted to social causes, whether that's in a direct investment or, in Delta Airlines case, a penalty. Is that something that you're seeing much of, organizations making that decision to take some of their earnings and commit it beyond the 1% traditionally that went to corporate social responsibility?
Well, I used to work for Canada's largest private sector employer, and that's a journey they started years ago in terms of really understanding where the organization was going and what it stood for, and that was led by the CEO. It was a personal passion of his from a CSR and sustainability perspective, but he started talking about the future of food, and it was something that we got the reputation from it, but it was really an investment in what that looked like and what that meant from an organizational perspective, and something that the employees and customers really rallied behind.
Yes, I have seen that also here in Mexico and in many companies in Latin America, that they are really investing now in different social causes, like health or good nutrition or some other items that are like main big issues in the country, and that of course they are related also to the principles and the mission of the company. But yes, I have seen like a race on the development of these kind of programs.
So just a couple more data points. Sprout Social did a survey. 72% of U.S. consumers say government and political leaders are playing a significant role in dividing society, but they're looking to brands for resolution. This was in a study called What Consumers Want from Brands in a Divided Society. 91% believe that brands should be using social media and the power of social media to connect people. In December, there was a global Csr Strategy survey of 30,000 people that found customers want companies to take a stand on current and broadly relevant issues ranging from sustainability and transparency to fair employment practices. The one I found most interesting was Weber Shandwick, their CEO Activity study. And this was mostly marketing and communications people who were surveyed in the US, the UK, and China. 53% are spending more time discussing and planning for executive and brand activism. 62% said they'd have a more favorable opinion of their CEO if he or she spoke out on a hotly debated current issue. And of those whose CEO has spoken out, 67% said it has had a positive impact on their company reputation. It seems that communicators have embraced this idea of CEO and brand activism. Do you think that has anything to do with why we're seeing more of it, or do they just like what they see coming out of their leaders?
We might also be seeing a change in age, right? When we think about it, I was listening to the radio this morning, and they were saying we have to remember that millennials are at the top end are 40 years old. And so I know that with some of the organizations I'm going into, it's not unusual to have younger CEOs who are just naturally taking that stance as well. So I find that yes, the communicators support it, but I haven't seen necessarily in my organizations that the communications are leading it there. But it's usually a CEO who has a very social stance, and they really take the lead. I don't know if anybody else has a similar experience.
You know, I think some of this is consumers and the public looking at business to fill a void that's created by a lack of leadership by our elected leaders. And, you know, there's only so much brands and businesses can do. I mean, you can bring a point of view and expertise to a debate. You can try to bring people together for solutions, but at the end of the day, we just need to elect better leaders. And us as voters. I think some of this is us bobbing off our responsibilities onto businesses and brands. The brands have a role. Nobody elected them.
Boy,
So
that's a great
I think some of this is on us
That's interesting.
as
Yeah.
engaged citizens. You know, we can't punt this to Coca-Cola to fix.
Just to flip this around a little bit, and it's interesting. I'm not seeing that anybody is watching. I think it's just a hiccup in Hangouts, because I know at least 5 people who were planning to watch. But if you are watching and you have a question, please tweet it via Twitter to COF42. That hashtag COF42. There was a survey from Chief Executive and the USC Annenberg Center for Public Relations that said 44% of CEOs said the most important communication goal they had for this year is to sell more products and services. 39% said it was to differentiate the company's brand from the competition. And when asked about societal issues that they planned on speaking publicly about, 60% of the 210 CEOs surveyed said they were unlikely to communicate about any social issue in 2019. For those who were planning to speak out this year, they were going to talk about data privacy, which makes sense because that affects their own organizations, healthcare and diversity inclusion, but speaking out on more controversial issues like immigration and fake news isn't part of the plan for the vast majority, with those hot button topics garnering just 6% and 5% respectively. Is there too much attention being placed on the organizations that are doing this because that's a big change, or is this something worth paying attention to because it seems to be a shift, even if it hasn't reached most CEOs yet?
I think, as you said, Shell, earlier, it really will depend on how it plays out from a business perspective. If a CEO takes a stance and is taking that leadership role and it actually hurts the business, some people might be gun shy. If they're seeing some uplift, then they're going to see that as something that they move towards. I think that you'll always have those leaders, those 5 to 10% who are going to take the lead, and there's the other ones who are watching to see what happens. But I know here in Canada, where a lot of the executives we're talking to are really talking about taking a stand in a business-related way. Architectural firms that are talking about sustainability, and food firms that are talking about diversity and things like that. We're seeing that starting up.
Now, something else that I think we should be aware is that a lot of people in the companies also think that there is a big risk associated with CEO activism and standing out. So, but for the majority of those CEOs that have taken a stance on an issue, their reputational advantage have been strong. So, so I believe that that's why we should prepare them very well. We should make them aware that there's a risk on standing out, but there's also something that can contribute a lot to the reputation of the company.
That's a great point. I think another factor to look at, another statistic or trend that we're seeing, Shell, is the tenure of CEOs has been shortening over the years and is pretty short. So we should also recognize that these women and men are not just leaders of organizations, but they are job seekers. They are aware that in less than 2 years, I'll need to find another position somewhere. And so they're looking at these same statistics, I'm sure, and trying to determine, will I have a greater chance? Am I more marketable to more opportunities if I've taken a public stance? Is my skill set appropriate to take a public stance? Is the marketing and comm team around me able to manage that? That has to be affecting our profession, the workplace, and CEOs.
So I guess from a communication standpoint, there's a couple of things that I think we need to consider when counseling CEOs. One is, if an issue arises that is aligned with our business, where we in our professional judgment believe that we should be taking a stand, how do we approach the CEO who maybe hasn't done this, maybe has been thinking about it, but hasn't actually taken action? How do you approach a CEO and talk about the opportunity and the risk here and how to proceed?
I think with that, like inside organizations, it's always started with a leader who talks about the CSR strategy. What is it that what is the company wants to do? Every organization is looking at where they're going to invest from a CSR perspective, whether it's community or environment, and it's really about what is the strategy for the organization first, and how is that aligned before we start talking about thought leadership in the area.
I'd also, you would need to come forward and make it very clear how prepared your Marcom team and the organization as a whole is to bear the weight of the public scrutiny that could come with an activist CEO. Some things an organization should consider is, do they have spokespeople that can manage this? Do they have a deep, wide bench of spokespeople that can handle this? Because if suddenly the topic becomes the activist CEO, the organization will need to have others that can speak about it rather than the CEO herself saying, yes, my company, So one, do you have those trained spokespeople? Do you have the nimbleness and the innovative approach that would be need to manage channels consistently across all your online? Should this catch fire? Do you have the additional resources in place to if this goes viral and catches fire? Do you have the resources in place to monitor it appropriately so that you can respond? Do you need additional resources to augment your team to handle an activist CEO and the daily job of your organization? So I think telling the CEO, telling her, we've got these things in place, we're prepared. If you want to march in that direction, not only can we support you, but the company will keep functioning. Everything's going to be under control, and we can manage, any of the crossfire that we get from your activism.
And I also think that we have to make sure that the CEO and the top leaders know which issues they need to be prepared. Even if we are not planning to speak proactively, but we have to be aware that the media and some consumer groups sometimes ask the leaders of the companies to have a stance in something, and we cannot say no comment to the media or the group. So they have to know which issues they should be prepared, and we need to let them be prepared for those issues, and even when we are not planning to speak immediately on that.
Another area we have to look at is our business relationships. Because it's not only our company's position, we might be doing business with another organization or a supplier or a nonprofit that we've made contributions to that somehow gets involved in a controversial issue. And then it gets linked to us, and people say, well, you're supporting this organization, you're buying products from this company, or you're dealing with this customer that's doing something that a lot of people have issues with. Are you going to drop the customer? Are you going to drop the supplier? So part of this is auditing our existing relationships, sponsorships, partnerships, to see if there's people we do business with that could be doing things that would bite us.
Great point.
We all know these days in this digital age, all it takes is a couple of tweets and somebody saying, hey, look at company X. You're doing business with these people over here who are decimating forests in Asia. Boycott company X and put the pressure on them. You got to know about these things before they come out of nowhere to bite you.
And we have seen some pretty serious examples of that. I'm thinking of Nestle with the palm oil in the Kit Kat bar that led to a very public boycott and protest. I remember seeing that Mattel, Barbie in particular, was the focus of some activism. I think it was Greenpeace, because of where the cardboard was coming and the packaging that they were using, where that was coming from. So this idea of a supply chain audit isn't a bad one, and then being able to report on the results and talk about changes you plan to make on that basis could actually earn you some good public relations.
Yes. Now, something else that I believe we should really be aware of is if we decide for the CEO and the top management to speak out to consumers and clients and others externally, first, we have to start talking about activism internally. We need to explain the employees why are we doing it, why this align with employee expectations and company values, and to be aware about the employee attitudes, expectations before we go outside, so they know why the company is doing this externally.
Right. I had a conversation about this. I shared the video interview with Ed Bastian of Delta. And I haven't asked her if it's okay to use her name, so I'm not going to, but this is an APR member, the Public Relations Society of America. And out of that thread, she said, my concern about this new and modern variation is that it risks destroying relationships, whereas the old school variation was singularly focused on building them. It seems misguided and the task misassigned that for-profit businesses can or should try to silver bullet solutions to highly politicized social ills, as opposed to educated individual citizens making informed judgments and choices, that is, votes on their own in our democracy. I'm curious about this, and we started this conversation with her asking about because all of the examples that we tend to read about tend to be liberal positions that are being taken by businesses, and yet you have seen examples from organizations like Chick-fil-A and Papa John's and Hobby Lobby taking actions and making very forceful public statements about their positions on conservative-leaning topics. And I think that's fine. And I think what that speaks to, we've talked about alignment with the nature of the business, but we haven't talked about is alignment with your values. And most organizations proclaim to have a set of values. And it seems to me that whether your values are right-leaning or left-leaning or focused on a particular theme, if there's an opportunity to correct or to contribute to the correction of a social ill that is in direct alignment with your values, that's something you should be looking at too.
Nobody's saying anything.
I was noticing that.
I know. Absolutely. I mean, again, as you mentioned, Shell, it's whether it's right-leaning or left-leaning, again, that connection with your customer who may be one way or another, and really trying to manage how you approach situations. I don't think that any organizations are telling their consumers or their employees how to vote, but they are taking stands on specific issues that they think are relevant and important to their people.
So let's talk about internal communications for a minute, because Priya, you brought this up earlier. At Facebook, a group of employees formed a Facebook group that was for disaffected employees who happened to be conservative-leaning in their political views, who felt like they were marginalized by Facebook's tendency to lean left and to talk about left-type issues, both internally and in their discussion of issues externally. Anytime an organization takes a stand on something, that you have employees who feel differently. So how would you go about addressing that? I mean, in addition to being proactive and telling employees, look, here's what we're going to say. This is how we believe it's aligned with our business and aligned with our values. We want everyone to know that we respect alternative points of view, both inside and outside the organization, but that's not necessarily going to make employees feel great when they come into work the next morning after this is broken on the news.
I think the one exercise that's always interesting when an organization is launching their values or trying to bring a set of values that they don't think anybody really understands to life is really taking a good look at them and saying, how does this link to behaviors and how are these linked to actions? And most of the time, they're really how we behave, not necessarily what decision, and some of the decisions we make, obviously, but it's really creating that. I'm a big believer that we need to let those that don't agree have their voice, and that's part of the values and part of bringing those to life. So I think there is a balance, but it's really articulating it clearly and making sure your employees are aware of what that means and what it doesn't mean.
Right, and I think there's also a cultural imperative here to address the issue, maybe with the employees who do agree with what you're doing, to continue to respect the views and opinions of their colleagues who don't necessarily share those views. I remember, I think it was the day after the 2016 presidential election, the CEO of a company, I believe it was Grubhub, which is one of the restaurant meal delivery services, basically said, here's where we stand on diversity, and if you don't believe that, don't come to work tomorrow. I admire the guy's passion, but on the other hand, even if I were an employee who agreed with him, I wouldn't feel great about going to work the next day.
Well, it's a good illustration of don't send that tweet out in anger.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Particularly these days, we have supercharged, very hot emotional issues. Usually a good idea to sort of dial back and let it settle for a little bit before you fire the opinion out.
Right.
Also in this issue, because we have to respect that there's a really broad spectrum of opinion and belief here, and that we need to support and foster an environment that supports that. It's not just what the CEO or the organization says, it's what they convey. So I bet we've all seen videos where the CEO or leadership are standing up in front of a group of employees and they're expressing what their opinion and what the leaning of the company and their activism will be. And they say, but that we're open and we respect all different opinions. But when that meeting takes on a rally-like nature, when the activist opinion of the organization seems to be what is fomenting applause and cheers among the employees, those employees that feel or think or believe differently are not going to really feel that the organization does respect a diversity opinion. So it's not just scripting the right thing to say. You have to make sure it's being conveyed. And sometimes those employee meetings and discussions take on a rally type nature to them. And that's wrong. If what you want to communicate is that you're open to a variety of opinions, then you don't hold a rally.
Right. And I think some organizations have been facing this as a result of some employee activism. We're talking about CEO and brand activism, but I think employee activism is another new development that we're seeing. We've seen employees at Microsoft and Google take very public exception to some of the projects that would benefit, for example, the military. They don't believe that they're working in an organization that should be helping to kill people, is the way some of them have put this. Face recognition technology for immigration, I think, was another one. And also diversity and inclusion at some of these organizations that have led to some contention at, for example, Google has a once a week employee meeting, and some of these have gotten very heated and are pushing CEOs into taking positions publicly that maybe they weren't ready for, which is another category of employee activism, is the one that they've been kind of arm twisted into saying, and it may not be something that they wanted to get into in the first place, expressing support for these projects that may seem contradictory to the company's, previously stated values, such as Google's "Don't be evil."
Yeah, wow.
But I think that, if you want to talk about,
it was a nice idea.
Yeah. like yeah, and they dropped it too. But you know, when a CEO is backed into a corner and has to come out and say, this is why we're supporting this is why we're not dropping it, even though a bunch of our employees seem to not like it, there's an opportunity for some counsel too, right?
Well, I always say that when a company takes a stand like this, if it's a shock to employees, then there is a bigger problem. that usually what happens is there's a conversation that's happening, and you have an understanding of who your people are and what they stand for, and what's involved in the organization. And so those kinds of announcements or those kinds of stances shouldn't be a shock. And if they are, they tend to be a disconnect in some way.
Yes, that's why it's so important that that we establish the purpose of why we are doing it and why it is aligned with the values and the mission. I remember there is also an Accenture Strategies Global Survey that was made around 30,000 people, and it was just released last December, in which one of the results was that 62% of customers want companies to take a stand on current and broadly relevant issues like sustainability, transparency, and fair employment practices. So that's why I really think that we establish the purpose and it is communicated to employees also and to all our audiences. That will help a lot in that, especially in this case, employee understand why is the company doing this.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples of doing this in a well-considered, well-thought-out, well-planned way is Nike and their inclusion of Colin Kaepernick in an advertising campaign, which is direct expression of support for his Taking a Knee initiative, which was highly divisive. It was divisive before the President of the United States stepped into it, and I think his remarks just exacerbated that. But they knew their market. They knew exactly who their customers were. There was definitely backlash. There were YouTube videos of people burning their Nikes in their barbecues and shredding their Nike apparel. But ultimately, their sales spiked. It was a highly profitable move for them, and they knew going in that it was going to be. And they were prepared for the backlash and prepared to not, jerk their knees in response to the backlash. Just be patient and see what happens. And what happened is exactly what they expected to. So they were able to take a stand because they planned, because they knew who their market was.
And because they're powerful. I mean, they are sponsors of those athletes and those sports teams around the world, right? So I think they really used their power. They took a bit of a risk, but it was a really great calculated risk, and they won because of it.
Yeah. On the flip side of that was Primetime Sports in Colorado, sporting goods store, where the owner objected to Nike's position on this. He was on the other side of the political spectrum, and decided to boycott Nike. He removed all the Nike products from his store and wouldn't carry it anymore. Caused him to go out of business just within the last couple of weeks. He went to his base of supporters and said, please support my liquidation sale. I think if you're Nike and you're worth billions of dollars, if you're Delta and you're worth billions of dollars, these are risks you can take. If you're a mom and pop store in Denver, I think the risk is higher, because if it goes bad, I think the consequences are greater. You don't have the resources to fall back on and recover from it.
In addition to their financial strength and size, they also had the Marcom staff and counsel that they went into this knowing that they could weather it, that it was, they measured twice and cut once. It was a calculated strategic move, as opposed to the small business owner in Colorado who, against George's advice, I think he spoke out from passion, and now he doesn't have a business.
He obviously also didn't understand who his customer was, because his expectation, if his thoughts and his ideals were aligned to that customer base, it may have paid off. We don't know that, but well, we do know that that wasn't the case. So obviously he didn't know who was buying from his store.
Right. Now, the flip side of how Nike handled this is what I alluded to briefly a little while ago, and that is the CEO who shoots from the hip. The sporting goods store owner in Colorado is one example, but we've also seen it from companies like Boeing, where they just speak their mind and suffer a backlash. Let's talk about the role of the communicator when that happens. It's not that they're necessarily wrong, that this isn't necessarily a good position to take, but just doing it when your employees don't know you're about to say it, when your leadership team doesn't know you're about to say it, and your communication staff doesn't know you're about to say it. In fact, 5 minutes before you said it, you probably didn't know you were about to say it. That's another kind of crisis communication, right? So what are the steps that you take when you get the email that said, we're getting a lot of news coverage, our CEO just said X?
So, well, there are a few leaders that can survive that. Certainly some probably leap to mind for all of us, but there are a few that can do that, because if your communication staff, if your leadership team, if your employee base are surprised by a leader's activism, it makes it difficult for them to support the activism. And I think on an ongoing basis, it will create a lack of support for that leader in particular moving forward. So that is so unwise as to be fatal for most leaders, that they won't maintain that position, or they won't maintain their athletic store in Colorado. When called to help that team, first I'd immediately do a vulnerability audit, because the CEO is asking for a lot of attention. So we need to know what people could find out about us. George referenced it earlier. Who do we get our supplies from? Who do we sponsor and support? So I think the very first step is, does the organization have a real clear handle on all their potential exposures? So doing a vulnerability audit to understand where you could be attacked, and prepare a blunting strategy to stave off those attacks would be the first thing. Next, who do you have that's trained and ready to be a spokesperson for the company about the CEO's activism? Do you have that deep, wide bench of trained spokespeople? What resources do you need to weather an extended, very public, viral sort of situation? Do you have the ability to monitor and analyze what's happening in real time so that you can be informed and make informed decisions? Those are some of the first steps that we would take with that sort of a situation.
Right. And, I think something else that might happen in the wake of this, and certainly did happen to Boeing, was that in Boeing's case, the president did respond. The president said something back to Boeing that actually caused their share price to fall. Another situation that demands some kind of response from the organization that has to be well considered and well articulated.
Yeah, don't get in a pissing match with a guy who buys tweets by the barrel.
This is an unprecedented change.
I think that
Go ahead.
I think we've been talking about CEO activism, but really we should be talking about corporate activism, because the CEO basically is representing the corporation as its chief spokesperson. So any position the CEO takes publicly has got to grow out of the company's values, the company's business objectives, and the company's priorities. A lot of CEOs who actually are freelancing on issues. I think most of them who speak out on issues are taking a very considered stance based on what's in the interest of their employees, their customers, and their investors and their other stakeholders.
We actually have a question that came in via Twitter. So there is something wrong with the YouTube Hangout that isn't showing how many people are. There are people watching. Great discussion. This is Stephen Ruskai. Great discussion today on employee communications in highly politicized environments. Do some communicators avoid many corporate social responsibility opportunities because they aren't aligned with the position of the senior leadership or wish to avoid that potential? Do you think that some of this stuff doesn't get communicated because the communicator just doesn't want to?
I've never seen that happen.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I've seen some interesting things from communicators. I remember working with one organization where a review of their audiences and the challenges suggested to me that they needed to return to doing something in print. And I was told, no, the senior vice president we report to won't let us do print because it's bad for the environment. And I said, well, that's noble. But the research tells us that's how you're going to get your message to this particular audience, because they're not digital. They're still using, whatever the circumstances were, it was a political belief that kept them from doing what, communication practice would say is the right thing to do. Wonder if that's happening in CSR as well. So
I would say that, like Priya mentioned, it's a rarity that the communication professional is not communicating what they should because of their own bias. The reality, especially of CSR, is if the nonprofit partner, if their issue or purpose isn't aligned with the business, then the partnership doesn't happen. I think at that point, once there is alignment, that's the most significant, and the partnership is formed. Where communication most frequently falls down is where the CSR program didn't at the beginning give very specific and clear directions. This is what you as the corporate sponsor can do. Not just write a check, but engage your employees, allow them to volunteer, give them a day of volunteerism, include it in your publication. We know you have a monthly newsletter. We know you have a quarterly broadcast. Here is content that we can queue up or we can work on together. When the communication doesn't happen, it's more often because it wasn't spelled out clearly at the onset, at the development of that relationship or partnership. It's never too late, though. You can always come back and build that plan. But if it's not being communicated, I bet it wasn't outlined how the most successful or productive communication could be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the organizations I've worked with have always had a CSR scorecard, right? That's very operational as well. It's not just about what dollars you send to specific organizations. It's integrated and into the actual organization and how we behave and what we do. So when we have that plan to begin the year and have a report card at the end of the year that we have to answer to, there is a communication plan that's often created to support it proactively.
I'm
Weird
not
sound.
kind of cool though. Very science fiction-y. I think that raises a really interesting point, Priya, and that's the say-do gap. I think, there are a lot of leaders who may look at this trend and say, taking a position, taking a stand means saying something. The only one I've seen do something in the last month out of all the various stories I've read and items I've seen is Patagonia with the donation and it was money, but it was saying, look, we're going to take this money we got because of the tax break. We believe the climate change is an issue, so we're going to do something about it. We're going to invest that $10 million in organizations that are doing something about this. If this is aligned with your values, you shouldn't just be taking verbal positions, you should be taking action, right? I mean, if the issue is diversity and inclusion, what are you doing about diversity in the leadership ranks of your own organization? Shouldn't you be able to point to what your company is doing in addition to just saying, hey, this is where we stand?
Absolutely. And when you don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
George?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, absolutely. Because, throwing out a position or a soundbite is easy. Making it hard. And it's got to start within your own organization. I mean, if you're concerned about climate change, if you're concerned about the environment, the natural question for your organization is, what are we doing about it? Then I think you're in a stronger position of opining on the issue too, because you can point towards the solutions that you're putting in place inside your own organization to deal with these issues.
We're down to our last 5 minutes, so I thought we'd go around the horn here and get any last thoughts that you have before I let everybody know what's coming up on Circle of Fellows next month. So let's go in reverse thumbnail order. And I know that you don't see these the same order I do. It's fairly random. But Priya, you would be first here based on how the thumbnails are displaying now for me.
The only thing I have to say is that, when an organization decides to take an activist role in an issue, it's not just about what you say, it's what you do. And there's such a great opportunity to engage employees and create pride in an organization when you've got that right and you've hit the right topic that people can get behind. So it's an opportunity, but you really need to understand your audience and understand your people.
Okay, Letty.
Well, as a conclusion of this, I would emphasize that we need to define the topics in which the CEO might participate that must be aligned to the purpose and values of the company. We need to develop a strategy in highly politicized environments, be well prepared about the most pressing topics like data privacy, healthcare, diversity, inclusion. We need to develop a high impact communication strategy, provide media training to the CEO and all the top management members, manage sustainable relationship with key audiences. And something important is that we need to ensure that our own house is in order before activating and be prepared for any type of crisis.
John.
I couldn't agree with you more, Letty. In fact, just to build on what she was saying, make sure your organization, especially for the marketing communication leaders, make sure your organization is ready, as Letty said, for any crisis. If your CEO is going to be an activist, then you need to have those media trained spokespersons, people that we've talked about, a vulnerability audit. But one that we haven't talked about is cybersecurity. Is your organization prepared for a cyber attack or a cyber assault? Because your CEO becoming an activist makes you a more attractive, more likely target. Have you prepared your other leaders to be public speakers on these topics? So it's that preparation. Pull in the additional resources that you need for monitoring or training or anything else. But before your CEO becomes an activist, make sure your organization can weather that. And George.
Well, I think these are all great points. The only thing I would add is bring a sense of humility to it. I mean, just because there's a lot of issues out there to comment on doesn't mean our organization has to comment on all of them. We should be focusing on areas where we've got expertise, insights, and ideas to share.
Excellent. And we had a comment come in over Twitter at the last, actually it says it was sent at about a quarter of, but it just hit the service I use to monitor this right now. This is from Mary Beth West. Concerns in the past year, and this is regarding, she says, PRSA partisanship resulted when leadership suddenly chose to start calling out political truthfulness infractions occurring only on, I think that's occurring only on the right, when it never made political realm criticisms before and to date has never criticized the left. I think Mary Beth raises a very important point. If you're going to take a stand and the stand you're taking involves people who are misbehaving on both sides, you need to call out both sides, right? You can't say, I mean, I know what the situation here was. It was a PRSA chair who was saying PRSA's values don't support X, when there were examples of that, not only from the right, but from the left. So just one more thing to keep in mind: if you're going to take a position, you have to take that position with a certain sense of balance, that it's going to apply to everybody, regardless of where they stand on the spectrum of politics or, social issues. So I want to thank
Shell, actually, just to add something to that.
Sure.
And I followed that a good bit. One of the things that the PRSA and its leadership called for was civility, and civility in discussion and communication. And I was really happy to see that. It's something that we need more of. And I don't think, especially communicators, should look for opportunities to argue or fight or send harsh messages. But really, we should be the leaders calling for civility and manifesting, demonstrating what a civil discourse can and should look like.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for that, John. I do want to let everyone know what's coming up next month on March 21st. On Circle of Fellows number 43, we'll be talking about diversity and inclusion, building a stronger community. So far, we have 3 panelists lined up. We had 4, but one had a conflict arise. Priya, you'll be here for that one, along with Jim Schaefer and Brad Whitworth, 2 of our other fellows. So thank you to all of you for the time and the insights today. Also want to throw my thanks out to Anna Willey, IABC Fellow, who coordinates these behind-the-scenes effort every month to make sure that we have a panel and we're all prepared to be here and talk about this. So thanks to Anna, and I'll see everybody next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.